These are the people of Kus, the Kusu, known to us as the Ethiopians or the Nubians. These people are actually not in Kush right now. Instead, they are in Iran, bringing tribute to Darius. But they are not just bringing it only, they are bringing it with at least 23 other nations. Each one of these groups and nations seems to bring something completely unique to each of these areas. The 23 nations are the Medes, the Elamites, the Armenians, the Araxians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Cappadocians, the Lydians, the Greeks, the Parthians, the Drangians, the Bactrians, the Indians, the Sogdians, Scythians, Arabs, the Cush, Egyptians, Libyans, Carians, Ciligians, and Sagathians. These nations seem to be in a staircase where they're shown one after the other. At the very end are the Kus, which they're traveling with what looks like a dog, but it's actually a giraffe. Next are the Libyans, who interestingly bring a goat. The next ones are from Afghanistan, known as the Drangiana, and they precede the Libyans. So we're still looking at the Libyans over here. And there they are, the Drangiana. So now we're deep into Arabia. And then afterwards are the Arabs, who bring a camel, which is to be expected. The people shown after this are the Skutra in the Persian language, but are the Thracians by today's name. It continues down this line, showing many, many nations, which I can show in a different version without showing these images. There is actually a beautiful short put up by a girl on YouTube, and it shows all of the nations. So you can see the stairs here. So these are the stairs showing all the delegations. So you have the Babylonians, Elamites, Hierarchy, Arakians, Medes, Lydians, Scythians, Indians, Assyrians, Armenians, Ethiopians, Jordanians, Capodians, Egyptians, Bactrians, Gandarians, Parthians, Sagartians, Sogdians, Thracians, Zaragians, Libyans, and so forth, each one bringing their own thing, like the Indians would bring spice. I personally think it's interesting that almost every other person is visually represented except the Egyptians, who somehow, the most important group really in all of history, have been sort of erased. And all you can see is the bottom of their wear. It's fair to say that by this time, this was the biggest land empire that existed. And actually, it tells us so much about these people at the time and the fact that they could all travel to this area. Now, you will notice that they are being escorted, each and every one in the image, by a Persian holding a rod in their hand. And look how they're holding the person's hand. This is true of the Nubians as well. And every single person who travels here is escorted as well. And so this might be a representation that they fetch them from the land, or it might just be a way of showing that actually they're more peaceful in their escorting. Like it's showing that he has really conquered in a way, and they now belong to him. It's not an enemy thing anymore. Now, interestingly, look at where the empire cuts off in Africa, and look at where it cuts off in Asia and Europe. Clearly, the mission was to conquer Asia fully. Europe and Africa just happen to be part of the picture because they are connected to the nations. If Genghis Khan had carried on, he probably would have done the exact same thing. Now, obviously, when it came to Asia, he went nowhere near China and places like that. And even India, he only conquered parts of it. And he conquered the Pakistani areas, which is interesting because we can separate these two in history. Another thing that's interesting is that the Egyptian doesn't proceed right after the Libyan. Now, it's a bit weird because Egypt was under the control of the Ethiopians not for much long before this date. So for them to be now just another part of a greater kingdom is kind of a humiliating thing. And so the Kusu people, also you can see they've broken apart, who have been taken over. They've just been humiliated in one of the worst ways ever. They went from masters to servants in a few generations. But it's not as it seems, because the areas that are conquered of Kusu are areas that almost are connected to Egypt fully. The real Kusu actually ran away and headed straight for the true Nubian regions, the true Kush regions. And as you can see with this map, cutting off the Persian expansion or the Achaemenian expansion, but we're going to say Persian for now. Now, the Parsu eventually became a nightmaric race. The Parsu are the Persians. The Parsu became a nightmaric race for the Ethiopians because they never stopped trying to expand into Ethiopia. But again, they were beaten backwards by the many kingdoms that then stood back in that area. Kus couldn't defend itself in Egypt, mainly because they didn't expect such a slaughter. But once they went back to their lands, it was impossible to continue. I've said this before, but it needs to be said again. I don't think there's any way in history that we would have had the type of world, the global world that we have today, if it wasn't for some of these early empirical adventures or these empires that dominated large areas. I think a lot of them inspired later empires. Like, for example, this one must have inspired the Greeks. The Greeks inspired the Romans. The Romans inspired the Arabs. The Arabs then inspired the Europeans. And then the Europeans took over the earth. And then suddenly we have a global world. And this global world is still under the neo empire that we live in today. And they figured this out back in the past, that you can dominate people without necessarily throwing a single weapon at them. You can easily just conquer them, give them a false sense of freedom, give them a leader, give them someone who's going to rule, but then that same leader bows down to you. We saw this in Japan as well, where there's a false leader, that leader bows down to another leader, but to the other people, he might as well be God. And of course, you realize that at this point, he is the king of kings. And to some degree, you could understand why he could consider himself a god king. The whole world bows before him, and this has really never happened before. If you are paying attention, you will realize that there were actually some writing in the middle of these stairs. This writing has already been translated, and we shall read it. So, of course, we started off with the Ethiopians, then we went to the Libyans, then we went to the Arabs, and then afterwards we see this interesting writing right in the middle. And of course, it's not somebody who is humble. So you would not expect them to say things that are humble. So, of course, the Middle East has had many religions. So we need to read this very carefully and translate all what we are looking at. So it starts by saying, A great god is Uhura Mazda. Now, this is a pre Judeo religion which only has one god, and it seems to say the same things that would later come. It became part of the Persian religion, Zoroaster. Now, Xerxes didn't necessarily believe in Zoroaster, but it seems like that Uhura Mazda became a one deity, so one god to rule them all during the time of Darius and those people. And so it seems that there's a pre-Zoroaster religion that was around that had Uhura Mazda, and then afterwards it would be adopted into the Zoroastrian religion, again probably causing inspiration for later religions that would be a one world religion. I mean, it's close to this date that you start to see Judeo religion start to take on this reality. Now, we like talking about the Judeo religion as if it's like this super old thing, but in real life, it really didn't even exist around 500 BC. Although Judaism claims that it started round about that date, the oldest we can find is about 200 BC. Now, you can imagine that from 200 BC of Judaism, and then within 200 years, you have Jesus. That means that the split between Christianity and Judaism is only 200 years. But let's carry on reading. A great God is Hura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, who made Xerxes king, one king of all kings. Now, here's the important part. I think that, like the other religions that believe in a unified God, that this is the mentality that makes you want to take over the world. I think having a mentality of a pantheon and looking at yourselves as this unique race that has to deal with itself, like the Egyptians did, the Chinese did, the Indians did, all these other factions, all these other people, they were aware of the rest of the world, but they didn't see the rest of the world as any of their business. I think is probably the reason why most other places, even when they're aware, did not take over any part of the world. I mean, think about it. Why wouldn't they? They have power and everything. And remember, in that question, in that debate between Kahindi Andrews, it said, if the people had the power, would they have just taken over the world just like the Europeans did? And the answer is probably no. The answer is probably no, because you need to have that type of mentality. And I think that mentality comes from this unified God thing where all of a sudden there's someone who's atop of the whole world, no matter how far the world expands, that king is on top of it. So think about it in religious factions. So because the world was limited to the earth, we believe that God was in charge of the earth. But then when we discover there are other planets, he's in charge of those planets too. When we discover there's other galaxies, he's in charge of those galaxies as well. When we discover that there might be, trillions of galaxies, he's in charge of those galaxies. We discover that there might be more than one universe, he's in charge of those universes. And so this mentality allows you to just consider any domain to be under the reign of your God. Whereas the Egyptian gods, they're not in charge of the entire world. In fact, they would have an Eastern god and they would have a Western god, and these gods would be the gods of foreigners and things like that, where foreigners would be added into the religion, but in a more, oh, they get to play around and do whatever they want over there. If we look at Genghis Khan, he believed in something called Tengrism. Tengrism believes in the unitedness of the entire globe, the entire world, from animals to ancestors to spirits to everything. And you can see how a thought like that could bolster or boost your thought that there actually must be some kind of unique thing that you should do to go and conquer the entire earth, that the world is your oyster, the world is what you need to go and get, rather than other people, like I said, who believe in their ancestors, that they don't have any business with anybody else's, that if you mess with someone else's ancestors, they will come after you. Rather, in these religions, they believe that everybody's ancestors pretty much come from the same person. The only exception to this is Alexander the Great, but he too had to novelize or put a novelty on his religion to explain. So he basically claimed to be the son of Zeus, and then he also claimed that there was a divine message or a divine thing that allowed him to conquer the entire world, that he was going through a hero's journey to conquer the entire world. It's hard to imagine today since religion isn't taken as seriously as it used to be, except in certain parts. You've got your ISISes and groups like that. But back then, religion used to be king of guiding people. And so when they wanted to conquer something, you could not do it if it was religiously forbidden. And so by putting this spin to the religion of the ancient Greeks, it made it very easy for him to go and colonize the other areas. Although obviously there must have been people who objected to it at the time. So let's finish reading this. One commander for all commanders. I am Xerxes, the great king, the king of kings, the king of all countries, having all kinds of human beings, king in this earth far and wide, the son of King Darius the Achaemenian. The great king Xerxes says, what was done by me here and was done by me farther off, I did by the grace of Ahura Mazda. May Ahura Mazda and the gods protect me, my kingdom, and what I did. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, isn't Zoroaster a religion that had one god? Then who are these other people? Well, so there's the duality, which we would later see in Christian faith and the Judea faith, right? The duality of the God. And then you also will see angels and stuff like that. And I remember mentioning this before, which was monotheism would not be considered monotheism by people who are not monotheists themselves. By adding stuff in your religion like angels, adding stuff like any other creature that has magic in it that could be praised, like angels and stuff like that, you then reduce the idea that it's a monotheistic religion. But to these people, it's definitely monotheistic, and these gods are actually angels. So, in other words, they are the messengers of the outer God, the supreme leader. Now, we all know that Artanism was the first religion to have monotheism inside of their culture. But this is not the type of monotheism that you will find in later religions. This is true monotheism. One God, the Sun, the Aten. This sun god is different for many reasons, but one of them is the fact that you don't see a true need to expand, even though there was already expansions happening prior to the Aten showing up. The banning of other gods was the second thing that was actually important, but as some archaeologists have revealed, a lot of people did not even care about this rule. They didn't even bother to think about it. They just continued their religion. And in some cases, you see the Aten right next to the other gods. The question is always, why do good ideas keep coming at about the same time? So, had the ancient Egyptians abandoned the previous gods and picked up the Aten, we would have no need to retrospectively praise Egypt, because today, obviously, because monotheism has won, people want to look back. People like myself, I will admit that, want to look back and say Egypt got there first. Egypt spread it first. Egypt was the one. And had they carried on down this road, they would have become the world's religion, the world's favorite religion, and possibly only religion. But because they abandoned it without even giving real consideration, then Zoroaster became a huge religion, spreading even as far as Africa. And then Judaism came through, running through the areas of Zoroaster and other now new considerations for monotheism. There were actually several other types of monotheistic religions. This includes Sharfadin, or the Yazidi religion. The Yazidi religion is a religion that's been around almost as long or as long as the Zoroaster religion. And it is possible that this is the religion that was at least adjacent to the religion of Xerxes and Darius. Now, interestingly, this religion too is not as monotheistic as the Aten religion. So, in the Yazidi religion, the god or the creator, which seems to be the god that is most favored by monotheists, that the creator is the one that is the most important. So in polytheism, right, all the gods seem to have equal power. Sometimes you see the war god, for obvious reasons, having the most amount of power, but all of these sort of center around creationism. So here's the difference: the Aten, right, is the only god, whereas in the Yazidi religion, you have the god, the real god, and then he creates 7 angels to take over the earth. Again, creating a polytheistic religion, but under the word monotheism. So there are many, many religions that we could talk about, but this is not about religion, and so I'll leave it here. But I'll leave you with this: there is only one religion that took over the world, and it didn't even have a god. They went further than Atonism. They went further than any other religion in the world, and they removed the possibility of a god altogether, and that's Buddhism. But yet, Buddhism spread throughout the Eastern world, dominating it to the point that we even know that it reached Africa. And obviously, in the modern world, it's one of the contending major religions of the world. How?